scared to give birth? Whether you're a first-time mom trying to debate whether to get the epidural or go unmedicated, or you're a seasoned mom who had a traumatic experience last time and don't want to go through that again, or maybe you're a VBAC mom and you're trying to decide whether or not to have that repeat cesarean or have the VBAC, and you remember the pain from last time, or maybe you are trying to conceive, or you're a first-time mom who hasn't even really given any thought to your childbirth education, but you know that baby has to come out at some point, and the idea of a needle in the spine freaks you out, going to the hospital freaks you out, the vaginal exams freak you out, but at the same time, you're not quite sure if you're going to be able to handle a home birth. Whatever it is, if this resonates with you, or if there's something else that kind of clicks in, it's like, yeah, there's something that I want and I'm scared of birth, I'm just going to tell you that you don't have to be afraid. In fact, even if you want a home birth, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're putting your life in danger, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a selfish person. Hey, I hear it. I hear it all the time. So I know what you're hearing out there in mainstream. And I know what your family and friends are probably saying if they're not supportive of your idea of having a home birth, waiting until the last minute, not getting the epidural, or not having a C-section. If you're trying to do everything possible to keep your body intact, I totally understand, and I was once where you were, where I was terrified of birth, but I also was terrified of the medical intervention. Hi, my name is Carly Bonderud, and this is the Reset Your Mindset for Empowered Birth Challenge. And if you've been following along with this challenge, then you know that we've had 3 sessions already where you have basically been resetting your mindset. In day 1, I told you that you don't actually have to fear birth. I told you about my story of how I went from just give me a C-section and a tummy tuck to planning a natural birth, and then going on to basically be like, you know what, I'm going to have a home birth. I got tricked out of it. And then I decided somebody needs to do something. Somebody needs to help these moms because this is ridiculous. A lot of moms were getting talked into C-sections, tricked out of their natural births. And, you know, I just was so upset with this that I launched an entire movement, which I call the Empowered Birth Movement. And now I've written my book, Your Empowered Birth, created a workshop, and created a whole program around this topic to help moms who were told, you can't have a natural birth, you're not going to be able to handle the pain, something is going to go wrong, and you can't say no to this intervention, and they've done it. So if you've just stumbled upon this video and you haven't been following along, then let me just tell you that this is an entire training series. So this is day 4. And before we dive in, let's just quickly recap what we've learned. You can watch this video into its entirety if you're just curious about this one piece. However, if you want the full transformation, then I highly suggest that you go check out the rest of the training series starting with day 1. So in day 1, I basically told you about my story of going from just give me a C-section and a tummy tuck to choosing to have a completely natural home birth and then getting tricked out of it by the system. So I opened up with the real reason that birth feels scary. It's not because your body's broken, but because of the fear-based conditioning that starts before we even think about getting pregnant. And I shared how my first pregnancy and birth experience was heavily shaped by this conditioning and the pressure to be a good patient and a good mom, and the silence around what trauma really looks like and how fear can make us basically hand over our power. Go back and watch day 1 if you haven't already, or if you need a refresher. So the idea is you need to recognize that this fear is not your fault. It's the result of generational, cultural, and systemic programming. And once you start to see it, you can start to break free from it. In day 2, I talked about your early birth education and why it matters. So at this point, we had already uncovered the secrets of why you're afraid of birth. And then I went deep into those secrets, talking about the fear traps and the 4 sources of fear, and finally finishing with the idea of our family upbringing. How our emotional wounds, not just in your story, but from your lineage, shape your beliefs about birth. And we talked about how birth is not just physical, but emotional and energetic. I shared a story from my second pregnancy of how different it was when I started to unpack the deeper emotional roots. I also showed you about how my kids are not afraid of birth, where I had grown up in a very fear-based mindset in my family, where everybody got the episiotomy, everybody went to the hospital, and when I said I was going to have a home birth, they absolutely freaked out. So we started reframing birth from something to get through and instead into the rite of passage that it can be, that's healing, empowering, and deeply transformational. So you need to understand that birth also mirrors your inner world, and healing that inner world before labor starts changes everything. And in day 3, I was dismantling the media myths and cultural conditioning while also teaching you about true natural birth. So this was a big one. We took a deep dive into how media, from sitcoms and rom-coms, had quietly trained us to expect pain, drama, emergencies, and trauma when it comes to birth. And we broke down popular examples like what to expect when you're expecting and knocked up. And I showed you how these characters teach us how to lower our expectations and brace for trauma, even punishing characters who have joyful births. And I also shared how I internalized some of these very same messages and how it wasn't until I questioned what I'd been shown my whole life that I could even imagine birth being any different. So by the end of it, you understand that birth doesn't have to be painful or traumatic. And if you can imagine something better, you can start creating it. And I just want to remind you that this is not a passive challenge. You can go through and you can watch the videos. I talked about the rule of 3 as well. The first time you watch it, you're basically just getting the overview and you're like, okay, yeah, I'm starting to have my mind opened up to something new. The second time you watch it, you can get those aha moments and be like, oh, I didn't notice that last time, but now I understand it better because I've watched the whole training. And then the third time is when it starts to basically integrate into your psyche and you're like, I got it. And now I have new questions to ask and I can also go deeper with this. But the real key to getting the transformation is implementation. And that is why at the end of each video of the Reset Your Mindset Challenge, there's homework to do. So you want to have done that work, and then you want to take at least 2 to 3 days before you do the next part of the exercise to really get that transformation and process all those old stories and challenge those old beliefs. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And if you find value in this training, I just want to remind you that this is the do-it-yourself path, and all I ask is that you pay it forward. Like, share, subscribe to this channel, pass this on to other moms who need it. A drop in the ocean creates ripples, many ripples create waves, and enough waves can change the tide. And I am on a mission to get you to the point where you're not afraid of birth anymore, but instead you're excited to give birth, like so many of my clients have been when I've shared this with them. And information is free. You only pay for access to me. So I am committed to you having an empowered birth, whether you work with me or not, whether you get any of my programs or sign up for my newsletter. I believe that every birth can and should be a beautiful, empowering experience because it's your initiation into motherhood. And it's also a reflection of how you do other things in life. And when you have that transformation, then you can basically take on the world, as you're going to find out deeper into this training. And if you follow along with my book, Your Empowered Birth, and you continue to stay in the community. So I'm really excited to get started because, you know, one of the things that we're really afraid of is the idea that something's going to go wrong. I talked about those fear traps. Again, go and watch day 2 if you want a refresher. But you're afraid of the pain. You're afraid of it being too hard. You're afraid of something going wrong. And you're afraid of medical pushback. Or maybe it's not the pushback, but it's the fact that your doctor or the nurse or the midwife might have a different opinion than you, or you've read something from a medical professional and they're basically saying to you, oh, you can't say no to the IV, you can't say no to vaginal exams, you can't say no to that induction because something bad will happen. Well, today we're going to tackle that, and I'm going to show you how it's not quite what we've been led to believe, so that you can unlearn that programming and start coming to your birth from a place of power instead of a place of fear. Think of this as the precursor to the empowered birth method. You cannot get new education unless you unlearn the old programming. Otherwise, what happens is that you have something called cognitive dissonance. That's really what we're resolving here, which is you've got this old programming telling you birth is painful, traumatic, you have to listen to the doctor, you don't know as much, you're a first-time mom or you're a seasoned mom, and things go wrong, and maybe you should just trust the experts, to becoming an empowered mom, and you're getting this information, but it doesn't work with the old programming, and you've got sort of this disconnect. So we're going to unlearn that, get rid of that programming so that you can come to your birth and have that dream birth experience and have that birth vision, and you can be like, I believe in myself. I can do this. I can advocate strongly, and I don't have to allow other people's fears to project onto me. Because one of the secrets that I shared on day one is that people can and will project their fears onto you. And the medical system does this too, as does our overall society that has been trained to believe that the experts know more than you do. So as I said, this is Reset Your Mindset for Empowered Birth Day 4. If you haven't gone through the rest of the videos, you may want to go back and do that, or if you want a refresher, make sure you've also done the homework at this point, because this is the final part of the Reset Your Mindset Challenge. And after that point, I'm going to also share with you how to go deeper with this. So we're going to be talking about why formal birth education isn't enough to get you past your fear of birth. And the question we've been asking in this challenge has been, why are we so terrified of birth? Even if we have this education, why is it still that we have these doubts, these fears, these feelings that I don't know enough, I need to trust the experts? What if something goes wrong? What if it is more painful than I can handle? What if the medical system pushes back against me? How do I get over this? So what we're going to be covering in this class is the fear loop. How the 4 sources of fear, which I talked about in day 2, keep you from planning and getting your true natural birth. I'm also going to be diving into the lies of the past, how patriarchal control and profit has led to our current birth trauma crisis. And I'm also going to show you how to shift your mindset for a better birth using the empowered birth method. So the attitudes and beliefs that we form from our family origin and the media influences how we initially respond to formal birth education. So basically, our early training at home sets the stage for how we respond to birth imagery in our society. And we accept or reject these later images and depictions based on what we learned as children, as I talked about in day 2. If we're taught that birth is shameful or embarrassing, we're less likely to receive a positive education. And if the media we consume after that depicts birth as frightening, painful, or shameful, we absorb those messages and learn to fear birth. And this all happens before we can even get to formal education. By about 9 years old, I was already terrified of birth, and by 7 years old, I already had my imprint. So I wasn't exactly a strong reader yet by the time I was 6 years old and got to school, and I couldn't really challenge what I had been seeing in the home and what I'd heard from my family, and the hush-hush nature of we don't talk about what actually happens with the baby. And then not only that, but seeing birth images on TV, in soap operas, on sitcoms, and in movies. Like, I just absorbed this education of fear, but I was still curious about birth. So later, though, when we receive a more formal education for birth, the new information will either confirm our fears and biases or come into conflict with what we think we know. And so cognitive dissonance, which I already mentioned, refers to a situation involving conflicting attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. So if you believe that birth is inherently painful, passive, and that you have no control over it, then it will be difficult to get past your fear and make decisions that you know are more based in evidence. And so what we're really doing inside of this challenge, what we've been doing over the last several sessions, is that we're shifting your mindset to unlearn that old programming, because once you see it, you can bring it to the surface and challenge it. Because when we change our mindset, we suddenly become open to the new information. So how do we shift our mindset? Well, that's what we've been doing in this challenge. We examine our own fears and beliefs about what we think birth is like. Then, where did these fears and beliefs come from? What stories did we hear? What media depictions of birth have we seen? What books have we read? Are there messages that challenge these fears and beliefs? What are they saying? Where are they coming from? And have others had firsthand experience of positive births? So resolving cognitive dissonance starts with challenging old myths and misconceptions. And our birth culture is a collection of beliefs and fears that originated from a deeply misogynistic view of women and the gatekeeping of knowledge in the medical system. This is also why information is free and I only charge for access to me, because I want to combat that gatekeeping. So how we came to fear birth is that our stories within our family of origin were influenced by generations of traumatic births, which were then reinforced by TV and movie depictions of traumatic and dramatic births, which has then led to a fear-based mindset that was then reinforced by formal birth education, which is typically based on the medical model, which then informs our media and perpetuates the same myths and misconceptions, which then reinforces our birth culture of fear, where moms filter everything through these three lenses of their later information, and then they're basically afraid. So that is basically the trauma loop or the fear loop that keeps you stuck, because even if you're seeking out positive birth education, particularly on social media, what happens is that you have now trained the algorithm to be like, got it, she's looking up birth. So what shows up in your feed is not always positive. Sometimes they'll show you clips from medical dramas that show terrifying birth imagery, or they'll show somebody's traumatic birth story, and they're like, I just tore up top because the devil couldn't get me. And then these moms are like, oh my gosh, I don't want this. And they're in the comments and they're absolutely terrified. When I see these things come up in my newsfeed, I'm usually combating the message with something positive. And typically what happens is they say, well, babies used to die at home. Moms used to die when they had home birth. So how dare you question the medical model? And I'm going to question the medical model. So strap in. Because until you fully challenge and resolve the old programming from our birth culture, no amount of birth education will help you to make an empowered decision about your birth. You must first go to that source. And that's why I told you about the 4 sources of fear. And we started with your family of origin. Then we went into the media influences. And now we're going into your education. So I'm going to ask you the question, what myths and misconceptions are you still bringing to birth? Because here's the most common myths and misconceptions that I see in the comments of a lot of social media, what I've heard in my family of origin, what I've seen being reflected in our media, and even in our birth education or in the mom groups, where a nurse will come in every once in a while and she'll say, well, I'm a labor and delivery nurse and this is what has to happen because such and such. So birth needs to happen on a bed, on your back. Childbirth is dangerous. People used to die all the time. Hospitals are the safest place to have a baby. Childbirth is painful. We must leave our dignity at the door. A healthy baby is all that matters. Birth must be managed by a doctor to be safe. Tearing is worse than an episiotomy, and C-sections are always life-saving. Now, in order to challenge a myth or misconception, though, we need to understand the context, because fish can't see the water that they're swimming in. And the origins of maternity care are deeply rooted in paternalistic medicine and misogyny. So you have to understand that way back when medicine was first introduced, it was all men that were practicing. Women weren't allowed to practice. Women didn't even have the ability to read and write. That was gatekeeping of information by a patriarchal society that basically saw women as property. So many of the common practices and beliefs about birth were based off of incomplete and inaccurate information made up essentially by male physicians who profited off the women's bodies as a main source of income. Because if you wanted to be a practicing physician, there was only so much that you could do. And as a male coming into a field where women had basically been employing midwives and their mothers and sisters and everyone before them, it was very difficult to shift them away from that idea of I'm just going to hire my midwife, she's cheaper and everything is more effective with her, to we want these women under control, because unfortunately the midwives were kind of undermining the patriarchal control, because midwives also knew how to control reproduction. And in a society that values precious progeny, that doesn't work. The other thing, of course, is that you can only do surgery on somebody so many times, whereas childbirth was seen as lucrative because everybody was having babies. That was never going to go away. And if somebody died of a disease that you didn't cure, well, you could just blame it on the midwife. You can learn more about that by reading Rachel Reed's book, Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage, in chapter 2, I believe it is, where she basically goes into this rich history. So you need to also understand that midwives were the original keepers of birth wisdom, and they were phased out over generations out of being able to practice due to the attitudes about women at the time that obstetrics became established. So they had the witch hunts, but before that they said that midwifery needs to be regulated because these women were usually independent and they didn't follow the system of the church. This led to the idea that, oh, we'll just tell society that they're all witches, and then a lot of midwives had to stop practicing because of that, or get under the influence of the church and toe the line. But, you know, maternity care practices were never created to support physiological birth. They were created for efficiency. So under the obstetric model, which was again created by men, and we have these ideas like, oh, yeah, like they don't even know how our bodies work most of the time. And yet they were still making up rules about that, about how our cycle is 28 days long and how our pregnancies last exactly 9 months and how we have to dilate X centimeters per hour. Like all of this stuff is ideas that men had. And then they also named our body parts after what they had discovered. So fallopian tubes, Braxton Hicks contractions. We are now starting to reclaim those terms, and we're like, no, it's the oviducts. No, it's practice contractions. It's not named after a man. So understanding that. So you also need to understand that the most common birthing position in modern maternity care, you probably recognize this from TV and movies, and maybe you even were put on your back for birth, or you already know people who were put on their back for birth. You may think that this is normal, or you otherwise see this image whenever you type in birth. And this is the most common position in hospitals. Like 99% of births happen in this position in the hospital, not so much with home birth. Now, the thing you need to understand is that birthing positions vary depending on individual comfort and physiology. Historically, when birth was being attended by women and midwives, birth had been depicted as being upright. Images of women sitting, standing, and squatting have been found in engravings and tapestries. Birthing stools were also commonly used to facilitate birth. Birth in upright positions has been scientifically proven to be more beneficial, allowing for the wider pelvic outlet. Gravity also facilitates an easier birth because you're not pushing uphill. But the absolute worst position for birth is on your back, and yet 99% of births in a hospital setting have mothers and birthing people on their backs or semi-sitting. But there is no right position to birth, only your position. And this is why I also tell my clients not to put birthing positions in their birth plan, but instead to say, I'm going to get into whatever position is instinctual for me, and I just need you to follow my lead. So how did we get to this point where moms went from being upright and birthing with gravity to suddenly being on their backs? Well, it started with King Louis XIV, the Sun King. And Louis XIV had a certain kink that he liked to watch all his mistresses and his queen give birth. But the traditional upright position with a birthing stool made it difficult for him to see what was happening, and he wanted the full view. So he had a special bed crafted so that his mistresses were lying down, legs wide apart, and their vulvas were on display for him to observe the births of his children. And naturally, at the time, the courtiers also copied everything that the Sun King and his family did, so they assumed that birth on one's back was the new fashionable way to do it. The other reason why birth started happening with women on their backs was the invention of the forceps made that lithotomy position more convenient. So in the 17th century, the invention of forceps was considered to be a modern miracle. They could get babies out when the moms were too tired to push or when they were about to pass on because they were losing blood or whatever was going on. You have to understand at this time, though, that rickets was a very common disease, and it led to many malformed pelvises and true dystocia when the baby gets stuck. Also, a lot of these moms were quite young. They were teenagers. You have to understand there was no birth control, and women were often married off quite young, before their pelvises were even ready to carry a pregnancy. So the use of forceps became so widespread that nearly every birth soon required it. And this is when they came up with the idea of the obstetric dilemma, and they said, well, the reason why birth is so difficult is because the babies' heads are so big and the moms basically have a upright pelvis instead of a mammalian pelvis of being on all fours, and this has caused the pelvis to be malformed and a problem. Basically, every time that something went wrong, the medical doctors at the time, all men, were saying, well, it's because the female pelvis is defective. Oh, it's because the female body is inefficient, and we need to make it more efficient. And they were looking at us in terms of a defective machine. So the twilight sleep era then came into play, when women started to get the vote and started to claim more agency. And they said, hey, you won't have to go through the pain of childbirth anymore. Let us just put you under, and when you wake up, you'll have your baby. And because so many of these women had been traumatized and seen the pain and the problems that happened in birth, they willingly went into the system not really knowing what was going on. And this is when twilight sleep happened, where they were drugging moms up on scopolamine and Demerol so they just wouldn't remember the birth. These moms were often strapped down. These moms were unconscious. They basically cut an episiotomy, and then they dragged the baby out with forceps. So then birth on one's back made it more convenient for the medical professionals to intervene in the birthing process. And this is basically where the training happens in maternity care, where they still have these dolls that are just laying on their backs. And then the midwife or doctor in training is basically observing this, and they're used to delivering babies with moms on their back, passive, because again, it's a doll. Now, let's tackle that myth, though, about women dying in childbirth. And this is a scene from The Tudors with Jane Seymour and Henry VIII, because, you know, when you watch these historical dramas, usually they have the reinforced message that there's a lot of women that just don't make it through childbirth. I'm talking about Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, George R. R. Martin's universe, where basically if there's not a mother in the picture, it's because she died of childbirth. And he has that even in the family tree. These women died of childbirth. Daenerys' mother died of childbirth. Rhaenyra's mother died from childbirth. And like Lyanna Stark died from childbirth. And you just keep looking through that every single woman that died, like every child that lost a mother, it was because she died in childbirth. So this reinforced message of women used to die before we had hospitals is usually the argument about not having a baby at home, or making sure that you just follow the doctor and you don't wait till the last minute, and you don't want to give birth in the car. You just want to get to the hospital where it is safe. But there are many reasons that women died in childbirth, but birth wasn't necessarily the reason they died. So historically, you have to remember that women were treated as broodmares. There was very little regard for their health being prioritized over the baby. If the baby was not coming out and the mother was exhausted and things were not going the way they wanted, often doctors would even ask the father and say, look, you have the choice between saving your wife or saving the baby. What do you want to do? This is horrible because often these husbands didn't even care about their wives. They're like, oh, I'll just get another wife. And then these women were subjected to horrible procedures. Sometimes they were even given cesareans that they didn't survive. And you have to understand that they just did not care. The baby was the precious progeny. The woman was the means to the end. The woman had a defective body and she had no agency. So you have to also understand that back in the past, nutrition was very limited, sanitation was non-existent, and very few educated men practicing medicine actually knew what they were doing. I mean, they started saying things like the menstrual cycle lasts exactly 28 days and there are no variations. And if there are variations, then that means that the woman is broken and defective. And they started to make up ideas about due dates. Go and read Dr. Sarah Wickham's book In Your Own Time, or check out one of my other videos where I debunk the myth of due dates because that is relevant. I can't get into it here. But understanding that they made up all of these things, that they understand women's bodies, and this has kind of trickled into our culture today in other areas that I don't need to get into, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So you also have to understand that the cure for difficult labors was often what caused those infections. They didn't sterilize those forceps that they were using on women. In fact, doctors were like, well, my hands are clean, so I don't need to do anything. I can go from performing an autopsy and doing my research to going and attending this woman in labor. And when they started putting birth in the hospitals during the Industrial Revolution, this led to a lot of deaths because of the fact that nobody was washing their hands and they were shoving fingers up into cervixes. So if birth was really inherently dangerous, we would not have survived as a species, because even before agriculture, people were giving birth and they didn't have the system of midwives and doctors, and yet we still have survived as a species. You also need to understand that with the limitation and outright ban of birth control by the church, births were often spaced very close together without proper recovery time. Typically, what you want to do is have about an 18 to 2-year spacing, because all that time and energy that you spent growing the baby and then birthing the baby and then going through postpartum, you are recovering from something phenomenal that your body has done, but it takes a while for you to get back to normal. But with the limitations and ban of birth control, and also the discouraging of breastfeeding for women in the higher classes, these babies were often back to back. And miscarriages were also very common because of that. But then even if a woman had a miscarriage, it was like, okay, well, you had a miscarriage, time to get back in there and have another baby. And they did not give that proper recovery time. So the lack of respect for the physiological process actually creates these complications. Pulling the baby out with forceps damages the pelvic floor and often leads to injuries to the baby's head, causing bruising and even brain bleeds. Cutting the cord immediately after birth cuts off the flow of blood from placenta to the baby, and cord traction can lead to the placenta detaching too soon, increasing that likelihood of hemorrhage. Cutting an episiotomy for convenience leads to more tearing and the damage of the pelvic floor. I mean, all you have to do is try to tear a piece of fabric that's intact, and then cut it with scissors and tear it again, and you'll see the difference. Also, frequent vaginal exams lead to infections and irritate your cervix, causing unnecessary pain. And pulling the baby out during the birthing stage also can lead to unnecessary tearing. So the lack of that respect for the physiological process actually makes birth more painful and traumatic, because now it's going against your body's instincts. And you also have to understand, based on the rich history, that maternity care was built on the pillars of misogyny and paternalism. And women were deliberately kept ignorant about their own bodies to control their reproduction and make them more compliant. They often didn't have any sex education whatsoever. They were told that their cycles were shameful and that the bleeding was only to say, I can have children now. And then they were married off quite young. And then in addition to that, they often were not told anything about birth. They were basically kept ignorant of how to get pregnant in the first place. There was a scene in Bridgerton with Lady Featherington, and she's like, daughters, you have to get pregnant. And one of them is like, I don't really enjoy it. And it's like, well, how many times have you done it? And she's like, just the once. And then the other daughter, she's sitting there, it's like, oh, well, we do it all the time. And it's like, well, then why aren't you pregnant? It's like, when he inserts himself. And she's like, inserts himself where? It's like, we just kiss, and then he makes some sounds, and then he has to go and change his breeches. And it's like, oh my gosh, like, you do not know anything about this. And this is what they did, is they kept them ignorant. And then later it was, don't worry your pretty little head about it. Doctor will take care of everything. You just focus on growing that baby and don't die in childbirth. But the dangers of birth were also grossly exaggerated to justify the hiring of the more expensive physician over the cheaper midwives. Specifically, in the higher realms of society, there would be these physicians that are like, you need to hire me so that I will be able to extract your precious progeny. This midwife that your wife wants to have is not going to support that because she's illiterate and she doesn't know what she's talking about. You want a man handling this. So even though the midwives were more effective for physiological birth and they also had other cures, the doctors were basically over-exaggerating the dangers of childbirth so that they could take over. And you have to also remember, men were in control back then. Women had very little agency, and cultural attitudes were that women were hysterical and couldn't be trusted to make good decisions. Your husband could actually have you committed to an asylum and give you a lobotomy if you were not compliant. So then the church also reinforced the idea that only women trained by the church could practice midwifery, and any midwife who did not follow those teachings was branded a witch. So a lot of midwives were also told that they couldn't do anything to ease the mother's pain or have her basically feel in her power during birth, because the church believed that women need to suffer in childbirth. And then Martin Luther himself, the father of the Protestants, was basically like, let women basically birth until they're dead, because that's what they're for. And again, you can learn more about this in Chapter 2 of Rachel Reed's book, Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage. So you have to also understand that modern maternity care practices are still rooted in these old beliefs. Aristotle, one of the fathers of medicine, way back before modern obstetrics was really established, he believed that women's bodies were defective and that the male body was the ideal. So this is why up until the last 10 years, most research in medicine is based off of the male anatomy and hormones. All of the medical testing, all of the interventions, the idea of how to diagnose diseases. They don't believe women when they talk about their pain. They're like, oh, that shouldn't happen. They are basically invalidating a woman's experience. And the only real research that was done into medicine for women was in the reproductive lens. And it was again based on pathology, menstrual problems, birth complications, menopause as being a problem where we need hormone replacement therapy instead of honoring our biological processes, and basically also saying that, oh, well, everything is just stress. Well, yes, but we also need to address that. So research in maternity care is also often geared toward justifying more intervention in birth, not less. Such as the ARRIVE trial. They're like, how do we reduce the C-section rate? Oh, how about we induce more labors earlier and that will reduce the rate? Instead of being like, hey, maybe our maternity care practices are what's causing the C-section. Now they're like, no, it's because the babies are cooking for too long and they're too big and we need to induce the mother so that doesn't happen. So misunderstandings of birth physiology and the long history of controlling birth in the medical system has led to this fear-based birth culture of birth is dangerous, women's bodies are defective, everything goes wrong, and we need to fix it on the outside. And so birth professionals are also trained to do things in labor and birth, not facilitate that natural process. And not even midwives are immune to this because they are still in that system and they are also under that same governing body. So even if they themselves support and understand the physiological process, when they are in the hospital, they are basically under scrutiny. Their hands are tied. So if the OB comes in the room and they're like, why are the waters still intact? Break them. The midwife has two choices. One, follow the protocols of what the hospital is saying and what this OB, who doesn't know much about physiological birth, but is seen by society as being more knowledgeable, she has to either go against them and get in trouble or support that physiological process. And a lot of midwives, they try to circumvent this by maybe doing something that's going to buy them more time, but also this still isn't supporting the physiological process, and there's only so much they can do. So my own midwife, she didn't want to threaten the episiotomy. She probably knew that I was going to tear, and she probably knew that I knew my own body. But because I was pushing for 3 hours, I was already past the mark where they would have given me a C-section in that hospital based on the medical culture there. Midwives were not really welcome. They were interlopers of the system. She was already basically thinking, our time is up. The OB is here. If I don't do something, they are going to call rank on me and I'm not going to be able to support her at all. And she's going to get that episiotomy she doesn't want. Because they had 3 OBs outside my room tapping their feet, wondering what was taking me so long. Well, I was put on my back. I wasn't being able to follow my process and they kept yelling at me to push when I wasn't ready. So understanding that birth professionals, even midwives, are not immune, and you can go and check out some of my other videos on how to hire your midwife to really understand this, or you can read my book, Your Empowered Birth. There's a lot inside of how to hire your care provider, which is an ebook that comes with Your Empowered Birth workshop. And you're going to basically understand what's going on in the system. So now we're coming to your Empowered Birth bonus action step. Write down all of the things you currently believe about childbirth that you read in books or that you were taught in some sort of formal education, such as sex ed or any childbirth classes. Include all fears or worries and anything that you've heard about what birth looks like. Be as specific as you can, including which source you got that fear or belief from. Look for the conflicting messages and filter those through your new lens of context that I've shared with you within this training. Continue to question the common fear-based birth messages that you receive from society and the medical system. So now that you also have this context, you're wondering, okay, my mind has been opened up. I now realize that the fears that I had around birth are basically due to this cultural programming. And now I want to have a better experience because I now know what's possible and I want to get out of this mess. But how do you get out of this mess and start trusting birth again if the education on its own doesn't work? Because I've opened your mindset, but there's still other pieces that you need. And that is where the Empowered Birth method and the Empowered Birth system really comes into play. This is the missing piece that I discovered as I was going through my Empowered Birth and being a birth advocate. And I realized that Empowered Birth really is the key to escaping that information loop and the fear traps. So the empowered birth method is based on 5 pillars. So first we have the right mindset, where you need to challenge the attitudes, behavior, and beliefs that don't serve you. You need to acquire new information that outweighs the old beliefs and fears, and reduce the importance of negative beliefs, attitudes, etc., and surround yourself with the positive birth imagery and stories. You also need to now see yourself as the decision maker. You are your own best expert. You don't need to follow somebody else's idea of what you're allowed to do with your own body. And you need to believe that your dream is possible even when everyone around you tells you that you can't do it. And with this Reset Your Mindset Challenge, you've already started to get that right mindset. There are a few more pieces that you need to cultivate to have that right mindset to be optimized. However, at this point, you're pretty solid. There's a lot of moms that went through the original version of the Reset Your Mindset Challenge that I did back in 2020, who went on to plan home births when before they were afraid and they were going to have a hospital birth, but they had had a traumatic hospital birth the last time. And they're like, I really don't want to go to the hospital, but I'm too afraid to stay home. And by going through the Reset Your Mindset Challenge, they were able to resolve that fear. The other thing you need to know is the right education. That is pillar number 2. You need to learn about your rights of informed consent and refusal. Learn about all your options in birth, not just the menu options that your care provider, family, friends, and social media would have you believe are possible. You also need to understand true physiological birth outside a hospital setting. You need to seek birth classes outside of the mainstream hospital system because most of them just teach you to be a good, compliant patient. And you also need to read books written by midwives, doulas, and independent childbirth educators. Books written by doctors and nurses, it's usually hit or miss. So sometimes there's a book where a doctor has had a home birth and she understands physiological birth and now she's educating on it from her medical lens. But there's also a lot of doctors that write these books for pregnancy that would never support home birth, and they talk about how home birth is dangerous and you don't want to attempt it. And those are usually the books that I'm like, okay, this is not something that I want my empowered moms to read, and I'm going to put it on the do not read list until they're ready to question those things, and maybe it's just for their additional education to see the other side. So the other thing you need to have, though, for the 5 pillars is pillar number 3, the right environment. The right environment is the one where you feel safest to let go of all inhibitions. Basically, if you wouldn't have sex there, you probably won't be able to birth effectively there either. And if you hate being watched, you need to choose a setting where you won't be disturbed because you're a mammal, and mammals do not give birth where they feel a threat, either perceived or real. To your body, it can't tell the difference between an actual tiger chasing you versus the medical provider who is putting pressure on you to either speed up your labor or to have a C-section. So your body's just going to shut down because it's not safe to birth. Now, the right environment can be a hospital setting if the hospital can support physiological birth and step back. And this is what I teach my clients to do, is to have an unassisted hospital birth if they don't feel comfortable having a home birth for any reason. So the right facilitators is pillar number 4. You need to choose a care provider who supports your birth plan before you hire them. All midwives are not created equal, so you need to do your homework and interview them to spot any potential red flags. I do have resources on my website, empoweringmomsbirth.com/freebies, if you want to get the list of 17 red flags to watch out for in a care provider. You also want to choose a childbirth educator who teaches the kind of birth you want to have. Many just teach the standard hospital birth with interventions, and as a result, many times you end up with those interventions in your birth. And finally, you want to choose your doula based on how you need to be supported. Sometimes you might want a lot of hands-on help, and other times you want your doula to just keep the pool warm, and you need to be hiring accordingly. Not all doulas can advocate strongly for you against the medical system either. So you also finally need the right support, which is pillar number 5. And the people closest to you can influence your birth in positive or negative ways. You also need to evaluate whether they're supportive of your birth plan or if you have to keep trying to convince them that you can do it. Because you deserve to have people who believe that you can do it. Anyone who's trying to scare you into accepting something you don't want will not be the right support. And your partner, if you have one, needs to be on the same page and recognize that you are the expert on your birth. They can't be saying, I don't feel comfortable with you having an unmedicated birth. They don't get to be saying, I don't want you to have a home birth. They need to be on board. And if they're not on board, then what I teach inside the Empowered Birth Method will help you to get them on board. Finally, you need to stay out of the mommy shaming groups. I do have videos telling you how to find supportive online mom communities because I'm not knocking the mom communities. They can be helpful. They can be a resource of information, but there's also those large parent groups that are out there, and I literally go in and I put the information out there and then I get out as quickly as possible because it's just a cesspool of negativity. And all I want to do is basically give a different frame than what's already coming up in those conversations where moms are like, do I have to be induced? And then everybody's like, oh yeah, because if you don't get induced, something bad's going to happen. Don't you care about your baby? And they shame the mom and make her feel guilty. So you want to stay out of those groups until your mindset is so strong that you can see all of that gaslighting and that emotional manipulation and the trauma that is happening in those groups and what these moms are actually dealing with and what they can't see, because then you can actually combat that. But don't go in until your mindset is strong. Now, we've covered a lot inside of this Reset Your Mindset challenge, and I'm just going to tell you this is the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more to the Empowered Birth Method. This is really just the first step. So if you want to go deeper with this and get your empowered birth, now that you know what's possible in birth, then here are your next steps for birth re-education. So I basically have 3 paths for getting the Empowered Birth Method. Number 3 is premium coaching. It's not accessible to everyone. I don't work with everyone who comes to me. I'm also quite expensive to work with. The reason for that is because I'm pulling all of my experience and I'm putting all that energy into that mom so that she can have that beautiful empowered birth. It is a time commitment, and that's why information is free. I only charge for access to me because even when I'm doing my group coaching, which is a little bit less expensive, I still only take about 1 to 3 students, sometimes 5, but no more than that. I like to keep those groups intimate. So live access to me is very limited. I do have spaces for laser coaching, which is also affordable. However, again, I kind of reserve that for my clients and for my self-study VIP students. If you do want to book with me, there is a requirement to show me that you can do the work. So path number 1 to show me that you can do the work is the do-it-yourself path. Follow all of my social media channels. Download every free resource that you want from my website. There's no email needed to put in to subscribe to a newsletter. There's no commitment. You don't have to pay anything. There's no paywall on this information. All I ask is that you pay it forward. Again, a drop in the ocean creates ripples. Many ripples create waves, and enough waves can change the tide. And I'm committed to you having an empowered birth, whether you work with me or not, whether you get my book, Your Empowered Birth, or pay for VIP access to me, or get any of my premium coaching, no matter what, I want you to have an empowered birth, because when you have an empowered birth, you're an empowered mom for life, and no one can take your power from you again. So the do-it-yourself path, basically, I do have master classes. You can keep following my YouTube channel. That is where I do my deep dive master classes. I have playlists available that you can access. You can also basically just pick and choose on my social media. I'm on Threads, I'm on Instagram, and just follow my content because I just put that stuff out there. If a mom is asking a question in the mom groups, or somebody has said something, or I've seen something on social media that ticked me off, I usually do my live stream rants on my Instagram, and then I later put that to YouTube. My YouTube is also basically where I house most of my trainings, everything that is free to access. So do it yourself is an option for you if you don't want to yet subscribe to the newsletter. The second path, though, is self-study. And you basically get access to the courses, the workbooks, and you also go through the email newsletter and subscription model for this. Basically, you put your name and your email in, and you get access to an entire course. And you go through that course, you do the work, and then later, if you want to get some coaching from me, then that's when you can get that access and that help. So information is free. You only pay for access to me. And within the self-study path, we have two options. You can choose the VIP option with unlimited email support as you're going through the course or the workbook. So you can just hit reply to the email and you're like, hey, I need help with this. And then I can send you an additional resource, or someone on my team can. And then additionally, because information is free and you only pay for access to me, you also get one free laser coaching call. So that basically means that for 15 minutes of my time, you have basically paid for that already through the self-study path. You say, hey, I'd like to take advantage of my free call. I see where you're at in the process. I will let you know if it's worth it to get on the call at this point. I'll be like, actually, here's a free resource. Let's save this call for later when you really need it. And if it's like, oh, actually, yes, let's get on this call so I can help you through this, then we book that. So there's an intake form. It's not like I'm going to get my free call now and I'm going to book. It's you fill out the intake form. I see where you're at. I see what you need help with. And then I'm like, okay, am I going to send a free resource? Am I going to send a video with a personalized message to you? Or am I going to actually get on the call with you? That way, you make sure that you're not wasting your call on something that you could have had more help in the future, because again, I want to make sure that you have your empowered birth. The other option, of course, if you don't want to get VIP right away, is you work through at your own pace. You just put your name and email in, you get access to the course, you decide, do I actually need help here, or can I get by on my own? And if you can get by on your own, perfect, awesome. I want that for you. I want to be able to put my energy into people who really need the help. And if you don't need the help, you don't need to pay. So now that you understand the self-study and self-study VIP, I'm going to tell you your next steps for your birth education now that you've gone through this Reset Your Mindset challenge. And they're both free. As I said, information is free. You only pay for access to me. So self-study step number 1, if you haven't already taken it, is to read Your Empowered Birth. Now, you can support the Empowered Birth movement by getting the book on Amazon, or what you can do is you can just go into the Empowered Birth book playlist and listen to it, because I did a video series on basically me reading the book to you and also telling you more about the backstory of Empowered Birth, so that you basically can just listen to the book, do the exercises, and you're good. You have everything you need. And if you do want to also just put your name and email in, then that gives you access to the bonus guides that came with your Empowered Birth, as well as a workbook version of the questions. So then it's a completely editable workbook that you can then put into a Google Drive and refer back to. Once you have read your Empowered Birth, then you can go on to step 2, going through our signature workshop, the Your Empowered Birth workshop, I call it. Now, I used to run these live in a Facebook group, and then later on, I'm like, you know what? I need to take some of my energy back, but I want to make sure that this is still accessible. So how you get this is you basically need to go to empoweringmomsbirth.com/workshop, This is the free version. If you want VIP, there is a link to go and get the VIP version. But basically what you want to do is you put your name and email in, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute, and then you get instant access to the course. Okay, so I'm going to show you right now how that works. So you go to empoweringmomsbirth.com/workshop. You get the free crash course prenatal classes that help you plan a birth without fear. And then I go into basically telling you what you're going to be getting inside of this workshop and why it's different from typical birth education. And here is where you're going to want to put in your name and email. And then I check the box saying I'm not a robot and get my course. And watch what happens. You are automatically redirected to the hidden playlist on my channel, where you're going to also get an email delivery service over the next few days, where I'm going to give you some additional tips on how to make the most of the course, including extra things that you can't get inside of this actual workshop as it is in the videos. And if you go here where it says the introduction, you click that, and you start your first video. And I'm going to just pause because I don't want the sound to overlap. But over here in the description, what you can see is I have the best results to get your workbook. And then keep in mind, if you want to get the actual course, the VIP, there it is. If you want to fill out a form, there that is. So you go for the best results, you go to the Google Drive, and there is your workbook. This is a completely editable workbook when you are using it on the actual Adobe Reader or one of your other PDF editors. And as you can see, it has got all of the notes for you, and you can just fill this out. And I do encourage you to go through that workbook. So as you can see, there's absolutely no barriers. There's no upsells. There's nothing. You just put your name and your email, and you get instant access to the course. As I said, I'm committed to you having an empowered birth. When you have an empowered birth, you're an empowered mom for life, and no one can take your power away from you again. So that's pretty much it. And whichever path you take, you can have your empowered birth. Information is free, and you only pay for access to me. All right, so you have completed the Reset Your Mindset Challenge. You now know your next steps. You can go anywhere with this. You can go and get the do-it-yourself path and just keep following our YouTube channel. All I ask is that you pay it forward, like, share, subscribe to the channel, tell other moms about it, drop the videos, share the resources on my website, empoweringmomsbirth.com. And if you want the self-study option, you have two options now. You can go with the regular self-study, which you just put name and email and subscribe to our newsletter. I do teach about Empowered Mom Magic, which is the next step after you have your empowered birth, how you can apply the empowered birth method to other areas of your life. And I also tell you more about the little secrets that I come up with and what else I'm coming up with in the empowered birth community by going through that newsletter. This ensures that you always get access to me through that newsletter, as opposed to Facebook algorithms or social media. Sometimes you don't see the posts. And then in addition to that, if you want extra support, there's self-study VIP or there's premium coaching. So as I said, I'm committed to you having an empowered birth, whether you work with me or not, whether you get any of my courses or not, whether you get my book or my premium coaching. I am committed because when you have an empowered birth, you're an empowered mom for life, and no one can take your power away from you again. So this has been the Reset Your Mindset Challenge. I'm so proud of you for going through this. If you found value, please pay it forward, pass this on to other moms, and I will see you in the community. Have a happy, empowered birth journey. Namaste.